Our relatively new home here at WeWork. As all of you know, there's a severe thunderstorm warning in effect till 11. The city expressly recommended that you attempt no walking, driving, or biking during the storm. Fortunately, none of those things are ever allowed in our panels, so you're entirely safe here to not be exposed to any risk. It's nice to be inside from the rain, but to some degree, dealing with the thunderstorm is a little easier than dealing with the topic we'll be discussing tonight, which is how to end segregation and deal with structural racism. Thunderstorms are easier to understand, easier to hide from, and they're over a lot more quickly than what we're talking about tonight. But I'm very glad we have this distinguished panel and all of you here to discuss it. I was reading today a little bit about the history of the act and how President Johnson came to get it passed in the immediate wake of Reverend Martin Luther King's death. Apparently before that, he had been dissuaded from trying to devote his last year in office to doing that. And President Obama actually recounted a story of one aide who told him that he thought it was a lost cause, and the president shouldn't devote himself to lost causes. And Johnson apparently, in his Texas drawl, which I won't attempt to imitate, banged on the table and said, well, what the hell is the presidency for if not for lost causes, or something along those lines. So he got his bill, and it had some effect, obviously, on our legal structure and I'm sure many benefits, but in terms of the larger history of racism and especially housing segregation in our country and in our city, sometimes it has felt like a lost cause because of the size of the problem, and because sometimes it's kind of run contrary to other policy goals we've had and taken a backseat to that. But now that the city is not only in the midst of this large plan to build a lot of affordable housing, we're in the midst of a national conversation about race that is surprisingly candid, if not perfect. And we have now a city process looking at how our policies do or don't affirmatively further for housing. It's a very good time to have this conversation. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists. They are Rezoned, the Deputy Commissioner for Neighborhood Strategies at the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. Welcome. Brad Lander, who is City Council Member for District 39 and the Council's Deputy Leader for Policy. Welcome, Councilman Lander. Shamira Pierce, who is the Policy Coordinator for the Fair Housing Justice Center. Thanks so much for coming. And Marika Williams, who's the Deputy Director for the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development. And she reminded me they helped start city limits, so I suppose I have to thank her. So I'm going to switch this on. This would be the mic that you guys have to share, so no fighting. So Councilman Lander, I wanted to start with you because you and your policy team of the council recently released a report about desegregating New York City. And in it you said New York City rightfully takes pride in its diversity. However, 50 years after the Fair Housing Act of 1968, our city remains sharply segregated. Someone from that mythical Midwestern city jumping on the city's subway system would not say that we have a segregation problem in the city. It seems very diverse. So, how so? How are we segregated?
It's a great place to start. Obviously, when you ride the subways, if you're on the sidewalks of Manhattan, there are places where the city feels integrated, and of course, it's extraordinarily diverse. But in the places it matters most, in our neighborhoods and where we live, and in where we go to school, it just isn't. And actually, since the Fair Housing Act passed, the average American city residential segregation has declined meaningfully, not overwhelmingly, but meaningfully. And ours has just stayed stubbornly high. They measure on the scale of sort of 0 to 100 by what they call dissimilarity index. How many people out of 100, you got to look at this in a sort of binary way, black and white would have to move in order to have a distribution through the city that reflected the overall population. We've been basically at 81, which is as high basically as any other American city that whole time. So our neighborhoods are segregated in where we live and not declining, and our schools as well. UCLA reported in 2014 finding New York schools amongst the most segregated in the country. And while, yes, we all endure the pain of the subway together, segregated neighborhoods are where opportunity is produced. schools are where, education and democracy are produced, and as long as those things stay segregated, then the promise of our overall diversity is just badly met.
So this is going to be a little awkward through the night, but if you could pass the mic down this way, I want to ask Marika the next question, which is, and the councilman began to talk about this, segregation is a reality in the city, and it might seem almost foolish or stupid to ask a question, but since I'm a journalist, this is what I'm supposed to do. So what? So what exactly is the impact of segregation in terms of social outcomes? What are the ills of that exactly? And who is affected by it? Does it affect everybody, or just folks who are on one side or the other of the color line?
So I think we see, so the hard thing is you sort of see the impacts of segregation a little bit everywhere. Right, from everything from thinking about universities who will explicitly say that they recruit students based on their zip codes, and that is where they tie back their outreach and their recruitment efforts, because in so many places, including New York City, your zip code does determine and sort of speak to what people expect and think of as your life opportunities. But then it also impacts in terms of, it is a big determinant of whether or not you're going to get your pothole fixed, and whether or not your streets get plowed, or what your schools look like, or how much crime you have, right? And so in the impact of segregation is beyond sort of creating communities where people get locked into a place. It's also that they don't have access to other things. It's then that they can be excluded from other things and prevented from accessing the other things. It's like we've created a city environment overall, not today just created, but have gotten to this point where different neighborhoods have different resources, look different, and mean very different things. And that's pretty clear and explicit as part of being a New York City resident, right? And the idea that a black single-family home neighborhood can mean a very different thing in New York City as a white single-family home neighborhood of basically the same average income is very telling.
So, Janera, next question to you, take the mic, which is, so we're here tonight talking about fair housing. We're talking about the federal delayed affirmatively furthering fair housing process, the city process that will kind of parallel that. That word fair is something you learn about in like kindergarten, and it seems very simple, and then you grow up and realize it's maybe not so simple. So you deal with fair housing every day. It's in the name of your workplace. So what does that mean in this context, in terms of theory and in terms of the reality you see?
Right. So fair housing is about, one, recognizing that the government and private market has created a significant, played significant roles in not only creating residential segregation, but also sustaining it. And in this context, fair housing is about, one, removing private market discrimination that exists currently today within housing. And a lot of people like to think that, the Fair Housing Act eliminated housing discrimination. No, it just looks significantly different than what it looked like 50 years ago, right? And so it's also ensuring that people can live in any neighborhood of their choosing, right? And so in this context, fair housing as a civil right is allowing people to live where they can live free of where they want to live, free of any discrimination or any other barriers.
So Layla, HPD obviously it regulates housing through the maintenance code and also facilitates the development of affordable housing. How does the concern about fair housing work into that daily work and those goals of the agency?
Yeah, so we are really trying to advance our housing work, being mindful of the history and legacy of how we've got to become such a segregated city. And we're really taking a deep dive into looking at that history and at some of the ongoing contributing factors. As the Fair Housing Act requires, we're doing our best to affirmatively further fair housing. And that means confronting issues of segregation, promoting certain goals around integration, but also doing that while balancing other really critical goals that we have right now, especially in the context of a high-cost city where population is at an all-time high. A third of renters are severely rent burdened, half of renters are rent burdened. And so those goals that we're trying to balance with our fair housing goals are creating and preserving as much affordable housing as possible, given the housing crisis that we're in. Trying to prevent displacement for renters and homeowners from the neighborhoods that they are saying they want to stay in and want the option to stay in, while also promoting opportunities and housing opportunities to move to other neighborhoods if that's what they want. And it's investing not just in housing, but in other services and needs in under-resourced communities that may have been underserved historically. So we're trying to balance, fair housing goals and confronting our segregated living patterns with these other critical housing and development goals.
So Marika, react to that or talk more about that, the idea that there's a balance, maybe a tension between those goals, right? Between the goal of, we've been talking for years now about the affordability crisis in New York. It's driving people into homeless shelters. It's having people double up with family members, stay with domestic abusers, move out of the city. That seems like a big deal. It obviously is challenging to solve. Is there a trade-off between addressing that and dealing with fair housing concerns?
I think the reality is there's a balance and that they're also inextricably linked, right? Our housing crisis is linked to and tied to our history of segregation and racial discrimination practices. In many ways, they're not a separate conversation, and so it's kind of hard to set them up as like one is on one side and one is on the other because they're the same coin, right? And I'm not even sure if they're the different sides of the same coin. They're kind of really tied together, right? When we think about what it means to feel like you're being displaced out of a community, part of that is tied to where else would you want to go? Where else do you feel welcome? Where else do you have a history and experiences of being unwelcome or being turned away or being discriminated against? What are the structures and both informal and formal that we put into that neighborhood that you might want to go to otherwise, or the neighborhood that you're in, where do you want to stay or where you want to go, right? There's a lot of things in that that tie to affordability, right? So just because we put a brand new affordable housing development that people would qualify for based on AMI in a new neighborhood does not mean that based on the fact that it is affordable means that it feels like it's accessible and welcome, right? And that is tied to the history of segregation in New York City and New York City neighborhoods. At the same time, it's also not a reason for us to say, well, that neighborhood doesn't need that affordable housing. So we have to sort of tackle both of those things at the same time and say, why is that happening here? We still need housing there. We also need it in this neighborhood, and then how do we start to make those connections so that people have the opportunity to stay where they want to stay and then also go where they want to go and see that there are new possibilities on both ends.
Brad, your report, which lists 12 ways the city can begin to unravel or reduce segregation, you talk specifically about housing policy, ways that it could be improved to further that goal, and ways that as it exists now, perhaps it's running counter to that. Can you talk a little bit about your assessment of that?
Sure, and I'm going to back up though, because I think drawing out a little bit of what Marika's saying is worth doing and thinking about the relationship of housing policy and how we got here, right? Because we had a set of housing policies that were explicitly designed to segregate, so redlining, slum clearance and public housing were all implemented as policies with an explicitly segregationist goal. And if folks have not read The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, it's a painful read, but I urge you to read it. So that was American housing policy. It was explicitly, had the explicit goal of segregation. Now in the city, we then, so that determined in many ways the shape of which neighborhoods faced abandonment, right? They had experienced redlining, and so it's not that surprising that then those were the neighborhoods that experienced decline and abandonment when the city, hit the fiscal crisis. After that, the city's housing policy has been largely to through renovation, first before new construction, put our affordable housing dollars into the neighborhoods that had faced abandonment. Now, that was not in the same way done with racist intentions. It was fairly logical. We've got these swaths of our city that have been disinvested. We're worried that it's going to continue downhill. Let's invest before there isn't a market there for market rate housing. Let's invest subsidies to renovate and preserve affordable housing in those neighborhoods. It made pretty good sense. It was not nearly as intentionally designed to segregate. It was not systemically racist in the same intentional way as those earlier policies, but it had the impact of furthering segregation. That's just the fact of it, even though it wasn't intentional. And I'm thrilled that we're finally at a point where HPD and the council, the city, are trying to say we're going to try to meet the goals of affirmatively furthering fair housing. But I guess I would argue we're only just getting started now. To this point, we have not yet really tried to use housing policy to achieve integration goals. And even inclusionary housing, which I've been a long time advocate of. I think we have thought more about being a way to produce affordable housing units that we need than as part of genuinely a serious conversation about what integration would look like. And then, if you ask the question you asked at a broader level, how to think about housing policy in relationship to segregation, and you would ask HUD what they meant by tools that affirmatively further fair housing, I think they would give you 3 tools, all of which I believe at this moment are a mistake. One of which is don't allow the community preference requirement that lets some people stay in their neighborhoods as you renovate affordable housing. We can talk more about that one. The second is this sort of small area fair market rent setting formula for Section 8s, which sound good when you say the first half, which is allow people to pay a higher rent with their Section 8 certificates if they're trying to move into a higher cost neighborhood, which is great, except that since they didn't increase the money, they just took it out of what you would need to rent a unit in the Bronx, saying to people, if you want to stay in your Bronx neighborhood with that voucher you've worked so hard, waited so long to get, you're out of luck. So, and then third, a real focus on the federal housing resource, in particular the low-income housing tax credit, a pretty scarce and important, but not, but modest supply of subsidy, and just ask questions about whether that is spread equally. None of which are, I think, what New York City needs at this moment of gentrification of new development. So the report was designed to say, what are some other tools that could come out of this new planning policy, like making sure that as we rezone, we're doing it in ways that are thoughtful about integration. And so far the rezoning neighborhoods have been low-income communities of color and not wider, wealthier neighborhoods of opportunity. That's part of why they've been fighting to get Gowanus on the list. But there ought to be an actual comprehensive planning process that says where do we want to grow, and that chooses that in a citywide way, with fair housing not as its only goal, and I think this is what Layla said before is right, but certainly at a higher level.
So, as you mentioned, the panelists, as the microphone's coming back and forth, you can grab it and chat into it, but I want to let Layla respond. Specifically, we're going to get to community preference later, but on this question of the neighborhoods that have so far been identified for neighborhood-wide rezonings, and the criticism that they are primarily low-income communities of color, and sort of what the intention or what the effect of that would be. Can you talk a little bit about that? What's behind the selection process, and why hierarchy neighborhoods work part of it, or haven't been so far?
I think first one of the things to just remember is that we're not working with blank canvas, and this administration didn't invent rezonings, and a lot of neighborhoods have been rezoned previous to the 3 that we've started with. Or the few that we've started with. One of the things that goes into that selection process, and HPD works with the Department of City Planning on this, is looking at where there's opportunities for growth. We do think we should be growing everywhere that we can, but looking at areas that hadn't been rezoned or hadn't been invested in heavily since the 60s. East New York was one of those places. And places where zoning is one tool, but where that tool can be used to bring some new types of development and to rationalize the zoning in those neighborhoods. I think one of the criticisms we hear is that that means that low-income communities of color are bearing the burden unequally of development and growth in the city. But if you look at where development and growth is happening, that's patently not true. The rezonings are not the only place we are building and growing as a city. So I think, I do take some issue with that narrative. And the rezonings are coming with a lot of investments that these neighborhoods need. And the rezonings aren't being applied in the same place in every neighborhood. In East New York, it was important to rezone certain parts of the neighborhood that didn't allow for residential development along Atlantic Ave or irrational commercial development. We haven't seen massive overdevelopment there since passing that rezoning. What we've mostly seen in East New York so far is affordable housing projects. In East Harlem, there was a lot of development already happening in East Harlem. A lot of the displacement risks that people fear around these rezonings were already there. And with applying MIH, we're requiring affordability where affordable requirements aren't currently there. There are a lot of buildings coming down and new buildings coming up without affordable requirements. So we're trying to introduce affordability requirements in a neighborhood that was already beginning to heat up. In Inwood, I'm sorry to just go through this way, but I feel a little passionate about this narrative that's really developed. In Inwood, there's been one new construction affordable housing project in that neighborhood in the past decade. So it hasn't seen very much investment. And rents have been rising in Inwood faster than the rest of the city before rezoning was even introduced. And Inwood, unfortunately, is one of the neighborhoods where actually, even before the rezoning was announced, we've been losing a large stock of the rent-stabilized apartments. So again, as we're doing these rezonings, we're also introducing other policies and really trying to put in place other policies that protect existing tenants and residents, anti-displacement policies, anti-harassment policies, and also, of course, I have to note that stronger rent stabilization laws is going to play a big role in all of this, and that's something we're going to be working to advance.
I just want to make clear, I was not making an argument against rezoning East New York, East Harlem, the South Bronx, all of which I proudly voted for. So this is my case is not we should not have rezoned those neighborhoods. It's that we should be rezoning more and more balanced, and that's not easy. There's plenty of neighborhood pushback. So I just want to be clear that
let's talk about the neighborhood pushback
against the rezonings that have happened.
I want to give the mic back to Leila because I know that there are elements of the community preference issue you can't really talk about. So I want to have you lay the background, which is what is community preference? How does it work, and what projects does it apply to?
So the community preference policy applies when HPD is investing in new housing in a community or in mandatory inclusionary housing projects. Basically, when a unit is going through the housing lottery, our community preference policy applies, which means that 50% of those units that are going through the lottery are reserved for members of the local community.
And Shanera, what's the critique of that, and how do you feel about it? There's a lawsuit over it. Talk to us about how you feel about that.
Yeah, we have, fair houses have a very strong reaction to community board preferences. Sorry about that. One thing in particular, if we know that our neighborhoods are more segregated now than ever, then community board preferences effectively maintain that segregation. And we really think that a tool to address displacement cannot be a tool that creates that is built off of discrimination, right? And so, and also keeping in mind that there's often a mismatch between there's a mismatch between the affordability and when we're thinking about the AMI, right? And so community board preferences often has an AMI. The supply of the housing available is often at 50 and 60% AMI, and the people who would actually be largely, who could actually benefit from community board, from living in that housing are at I think 20 to 30% AMI, right? So they can't even afford the housing that will be created essentially for them to stay within their communities, right? And so we think there needs to be just some different ideas, right, to address displacement within our communities, and we just don't think that community board preference will be one of them.
Let's just do a quick walk check. Does everybody know what AMI is? Or everyone's not? No, someone's not. Quick definition of AMI for those of us who are uninitiated.
Well, if you would like, we will schedule, ANHD will be releasing our new AMI cheat sheet in the next month or so you can refer to that. Can't even get a little sheet, but let's just see all the numbers. Area median income, which is how we calculate what income threshold and the number of people you have in your household determines whether or not, what level you can qualify for an affordable housing unit that's subsidized by either the federal, city, or state level. Everybody uses the same calculation. AMI is regional, so it's the median, it's calculated based off the median income of the New York metropolitan region, which includes Connecticut, New Jersey, and Westchester, parts of Pennsylvania too. Sometimes it changes, right? Yeah, it changes a little bit. So everybody sort of ties back to this AMI number. Median income for New York City and median and AMI, like the actual middle number, are not the same thing. They tend to be off from each other about $20,000-ish. So if you looked at the median income for the metropolitan region and compared that to New York City, we're probably, Jared's like, this is more than I wanted. We're more at like $75,000, and the median income is more at like 95-ish.
So, having schooled us on AMI, talk about community preference. Here's the question I want to ask: is, the defense you hear of community preference is, well, if we didn't do that, communities would really hate the housing we want to build there. Is there an argument for community preference other than communities would hate it if we didn't have it? What's the rationale for it?
Well, so I will say, thinking about ANHD's membership, we have more than 100 community groups across the city in various neighborhoods, and folks have different positions on it, so we sort of hear this in different ways. One of the challenges is that community preference treats these neighborhoods and individuals the same regardless of their current experience and their historical experience and their historical access sort of uniformly, right? So, and it is also in a little bit of ways blind to what else is happening and what other forces are happening that reinforce segregation, right? So there is an argument around community preference that as a Black woman, the barrier for me accessing a unit on the Upper East Side is not just my AMI level or my income level, but also all these other informal and formal versions of discrimination. Being discriminated against based on mortgage lending, qualifications, steering, co-op boards, etc., etc. And so actually there is a much larger, greater barrier to being able to enter into other neighborhoods that seemingly otherwise are fair, which is then even more of an impetus for folks needing to have access to those units in their own neighborhood. That is something that we've sort of repeatedly heard. And so I think it sort of begs the question of, there are some people who would want and could use community preference as an exercise for keeping people out. There are also other people who are exercising and using community preference as a way of being able to stay and continue and exist and maintain being a New York City resident. And those are two very different things that are sort of tied to the same policy.
Thank you. I just want to chime in and follow up on this one, because I think first, there's several reasons why community preference is not just kind of the smarter strategic policy, but at some level the right policy. First, the desire to be able to stay in and live in the neighborhood where you were born and grew up, if you would like to, is a reasonable thing to try to deliver for people. Is it at some tension with segregation in a segregated city? Of course it is. But you've grown up in a place, you've got a school, you've got a church, you want to try to live there, and the idea that as your neighborhood gets gentrified and prices rise, you're going to get pushed out, and we ought to celebrate that in the name of either development or fair housing just seems goofy to me. Now, first and foremost, we ought to strengthen the rent law, so you can stay in the unit you're already in. And like we bypass this. The number one way to help people stay as neighborhoods change would be by closing the loopholes in the rent laws. The governor and the state legislature have failed to do that, and yet we're not usually able to kind of bring them in to this conversation. So I want to do it. To me, if I could do just one thing to support a more integrated city amidst development, it would be close the loopholes in the rent laws, and that responsibility belongs to Andrew Cuomo and the state legislature, and we should not let them off the hook as though it's a different conversation. But you also grow up. You want to move nearby. You want to move out of your home. You need some place to do it. The idea that you should have some extra chance to be able to stay in your neighborhood as prices rise, it just makes sense. If we love neighborhoods, if we love the city, and giving people in half the affordable units the chance to do that seems a perfectly sensible thing to me, when the other half of the units would be available for people from elsewhere. I'd be happy to see that other half of the units prioritize people least likely to be able to live in that neighborhood otherwise as a matter of integration policy, but it just seems to be sensible. And then, on the point that you raised or initially with a little bit dismissive, I guess I wouldn't be dismissive of it. We need more housing units in this city at every income level, and they are hard to build. No one is excited about changing their neighborhood. No one is excited about new housing at heights taller than the existing housing stock. There is across the board, whether it's fear of displacement or blotting out the sky or loss of parking spaces, real resistance to development, and yet we gotta have more units in lots and lots of places. And if we're gonna do that, we have to be able to persuade people not to resist so strongly. And we could talk more about lots of ways to do that, but boy, yes, one good way of doing that is it might mean that you or your son or daughter would have a chance to stay in your neighborhood in an affordable unit as prices rise. And does that mean we have to work harder on other fair housing strategies? For sure. But does it mean we should abandon that policy? I really don't think it does.
Janera, I wanted to ask, we're going to talk in a moment about the city's, you might have things you want to respond to as well, but as well, we're going to talk soon about the city's process for self-evaluating.
Yeah.
But we've been talking almost exclusively here about government policy and the role of government, city, and federal, and to a lesser extent state. What about the mechanisms in place now in the city to prevent or punish discrimination in housing by private actors? How strong are those mechanisms? How accessible are they? Give us a quick, in the sense of less than 45 minutes, rundown of what you think of those.
Sure. I just want to go on record by saying fair housing groups are not proponents of displacement and gentrification.
I didn't say that.
I mean, I'm just want to put that out there, and because the conversation becomes a little disingenuous when we begin to liken some of our efforts when we liken some of our efforts in aiding in displacement. So just putting that out there. But so private market. I'm sorry. Can you repeat your question?
Sure. Mechanisms the city has in place to prevent or to punish discrimination by private actors in the housing market.
Well, the city does have some mechanisms in place. By virtue, you can definitely file complaints through, I think, human rights, right? City Commission for Human Rights, and as well as also just filing an administrative complaint with HUD. But it's been in our experience, especially as operating as a private civil rights organization, that not only investigates segregation claims of discrimination, but also files cases against agents acting badly. It can be landlords or property owners, what have you. And so what we see is that what exists at the current level, these things are not strong enough, right? Because what we're still seeing levels of discrimination is about as persistent now as it was prior to the Federal Fair Housing Act. And so there should be more done, and especially as we're thinking about like expanding protected classes at the city level, as well as not only the protections, but the actual enforcement of it, doing more to actually test and go out into communities to suss out illegal discrimination that is happening with supervisors, superintendents, landlords, what have agents of that property, but also as well as taking that testing evidence and actually enforcing rights, right? And getting people access, opening up housing that has been previously closed away from people, from marginalized communities, and also doing more around ensuring that there should be no way in the world why property developers are still developing inaccessible housing, right? In the wake of not only the Fair Housing Act, but also different disability causes as well. And so we have to be, I think there are some things that exist, but is the city actually tackling them to the, in a way that is actually expanding housing choice? We don't think so, right?
Rika?
So I think one piece of this, I'll give credit to HPD in what they have done in the past 4 years or so. I think the HPD has really taken a look at what their rules are in their units. So one of the things that we saw and that AMHG and our membership sort of brought up in HPD was like, yes, let's talk about this, was changing the rules around what the credit requirements landlords could set in units that had HPD financing. Because what we sort of saw and started to realize was, this is going back to these numbers, 40% AMI. So this is a unit that's supposed to be for somebody, a household of 4 making $50,000, and they're asking for a perfect credit score. Like, who are you really aiming for, and who are you intentionally or unintentionally trying to not have access this unit, right? And so for the first time ever, HPD came out with guidelines on what should be credit score targets and what's an inappropriate range tied to various different AMI levels. But I would echo what Shanira is saying, which is, but the vast majority of us are still operating in the private market, right? Most of us don't actually have housing that is tied to NYCHA or Section 8 or an HPD subsidy or tax credits, any of those things. So what does it look like to require, enforce, insure, and then also penalize people when they break that in the vast majority of the rest of the housing market that we all sort of live in and exist in every day?
And just as a quick point of information for the public, we've been talking a lot about race, but someone referred to there are many more protected classes. Can we talk just about some of the other things that are covered in the federal and the city laws?
Yeah, so at the federal level, I believe that there are 6 protected classes. It's race, national origin, disability, sex, family status, and
Religion.
age.
And religion.
And religion, right. And so, and then at the the states and local levels, counties, municipalities, they can require they can have different coverage for for different protected classes, right? So at the state level, and it can also be very different than what's covered at the local level. So some of the protected classes are victims of stalking. That we have that at the city level. We have, of course, disability. Source of income, of course, and we're trying to actually get that at the state level as well.
How can we not have it at the state level already?
Oh, very good question.
And source of income, just for folks, if you have a Section 8 voucher.
Yes, if you have a Section 8 voucher, or if you use any form of non-wage income to pay for your housing accommodations, and if you're being discriminated in the private market for using those particular vouchers or non-wage income rather, that is source of income discrimination, right? And so, yeah. There are, I think, gender expression at the state level. Veterans, of course, veterans.
Military.
Veterans, military, that's at
Marital
the
status.
marital status as well. Those are at the state level. So it goes, but to be really clear, like New York City has a vast amount of protected classes. Now, I definitely argue we should be including some more people like arrest and conviction records, but and looking critically at how those populations are often excluded out of housing or kept out of housing opportunities. But we do have a vast majority of protected classes at the city level, but and at the state level not so much. But we're going to get there, right?
Layla, so let's talk about the process the city has begun, the 2-year process or so, Where We Live NYC. Give us a little bit of the background and then what that is going to look like, what its aims are.
Yeah, so Where We Live NYC is our comprehensive fair housing planning process. We need to come up with a better tagline for that. But it comes out of the 2015 HUD rule, Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule, that instituted a new requirement for municipalities to do, or jurisdictions receiving HUD funding, to do an assessment of fair housing. So we had been kind of gearing up through that 2015 rule, it had mandated that we do ours and get ready to submit it in the fall of 2019. We were kind of gearing up to get ready to do the planning for this assessment of fair housing, which
Can I
is really
just stop
digging.
you one quick second? The word affirmatively is so important, and that was an issue or part of the initial Fair Housing Act,
Yeah.
but getting it actualized has been difficult. What does affirmatively mean in this context?
Yeah, and correct me if I'm missing anything here. I think the 2015 rule actually was a key moment in trying to define affirmatively. I think prior to that, a lot of jurisdictions were saying that there wasn't enough guidance and they didn't know what it meant to affirmatively further fair housing. Beyond the fair housing requirements to combat discrimination. But affirmatively furthering fair housing means that you are taking kind of a more proactive approach to make sure your housing investments, you're not just combating discrimination, but you're actually trying to achieve fair housing goals like combating segregation, creating more integrated neighborhoods, and doing more place-based investment in under-resourced neighborhoods to create more access to opportunity, taking that kind of balanced approach in your housing investments in a way that furthers fair housing goals. So it's not just combating discrimination, but kind of making sure that you have fair housing goals, mostly around access to opportunity and combating segregation integrated into your goals.
And so the city's process, sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, so we were gearing up to get ready to do our assessment when the new rule under the new federal administration came out, which they basically came out to delay the implementation of the Obama era rule, which basically is an effort to undermine that law and that work. It was a moment for us to say, should we stop this work? No, our obligations are still there under the Fair Housing Act. And this is really an important moment for the city to be tackling these issues. So we decided to just move forward. We're not calling it an assessment of fair housing because that's kind of the HUD terminology. In HUD's delay of the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, they required municipalities to go back to the old system of doing what's called an analysis of impediments. It's this very kind of unfortunately meaningless process. So we will be submitting our report that we developed through our Where We Live process under the guise of that requirement to do an analysis of impediments. We're still aiming to have it complete by the fall of 2019. But what it really is us doing a few things. It's doing really extensive data and policy analysis around residential living patterns in the city and how those correlate with a range of indicators having to do with access to opportunity, looking at how they relate to access to educational opportunities, how they correlate with health inequities and health disparities. There's a lot of desktop research, and then there's a large component of this that is about a year-long community engagement process where we're engaging a range of stakeholders to help us dig into these issues and take a deep dive into looking at beyond the data, what's the experience on the ground, both from the perspective of organizations and the perspective of everyday New Yorkers. How does where you live and where you choose to live impact your access to opportunity and your family's access to opportunity? We'll be doing that engagement, we'll be doing that analysis, and coming out of that, we're going to be creating real goals and potentially new policies that try to get at our certain fair housing issues. So it goes beyond housing as well. We'll be partnering with multiple other city agencies.
So Marika, talk about the process as it's rolling out. What are your hopes for it, and who are you hoping is kind of at that table, part of this discussion?
So we've had the big kickoff meeting, and I think we're in the process of the first set of sort of like roundtable meetings around more specific issue areas or topic areas. In a sense, I've got a sort of scapegoat answer for who I want to be a part of the process, which is everybody. It's sort of a little bit of my answer. In the perfect ideal world, we'd be able to have this conversation with every single New Yorker, but that's not a real thing, and it would take way longer than a year. But I think we know that this conversation really needs to happen beyond the folks who sort of operate in fair housing and think about fair housing now, beyond just housing actors, right? Thinking about what this means for transportation, what does this mean for schools, what does this mean when we think about environment, when we think about health, right? These are all very tied to and linked to where we live, and that all has to be a part of the fair housing and affirmatively fair housing conversation. And so I think there is an opportunity to sort of cast a wider conversation than what we traditionally talk about in terms of housing and housing development and preservation. And hopefully, as a city, have a much more honest, much more frank conversation around race and segregation than we have had in my history of looking at this in New York City. That really just hasn't been a conversation that we've had, that folks feel comfortable having, that folks want to broach. It's like we have all these sort of subtle ways of suggesting that we're talking about that. We use income as a substitute for race. We talk about class, but like we have to talk about these things explicitly, and the experience of Black and Latino, but then also Vietnamese versus Filipino versus, right, and sort of dig into what does that all mean to be a New Yorker and try to navigate where you live in your home, in your community, and what you access.
So I want Brad or Gennaro to weigh in on this question, which is, I think yesterday Governor Cuomo announced that he's suing HUD for delaying the implementation of this rule. And I wonder, rather than sue HUD, why doesn't he take something out of the de Blasio playbook and just do it himself? He is a governor who, how do we put this, has not been shy to intrude on the affairs of individual municipalities, and I don't see why we don't do it in this area as well.
Well, I'll go beyond that. Some states have statewide fair housing policies. So Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, even Illinois, California's. And it's worth broadening out and thinking about the regional context here. There's a lot we can do in New York City on these issues. But obviously the segregation of the country, the segregation of the state, is, urban, suburban as well. I made that kind of snide joke before about source of income not being a law, discrimination not being prohibited at the state level. But what that means is landlords in Nassau and Suffolk and Westchester are totally within their rights to say, don't apply here if you have a Section 8 certificate. We don't take people who do. So that's what we currently have. What those fair housing policies do that are serious statewide, it'd be great to say every municipality and the state itself, as a matter of state law, have to go through this process to affirmatively further fair housing. It'd be even better to do what Massachusetts and Connecticut have, which is a version which says, we're going to actually look at every county or municipality in the state, and if you've got something like a fair share of affordable housing, great. And if you don't have something like your fair share of affordable housing, then you're going to have to put a plan in place to build it. And we'll offer some technical assistance and the state subsidy resources and tax-exempt bond financing and tax credits and subsidies to help you do it. You can use inclusionary zoning, you can use these policies. And if you refuse to do it, then we're going to use state authority to let builders override your local zoning laws to build housing at higher density to create more affordable units. So that's the law of the land in different ways in Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, California, Illinois, and it's nowhere close to the law of the land in New York State. So if Governor Cuomo has gotten the gospel on fair housing, yes, absolutely put a statewide law in place that requires all counties and municipalities to do a process like where we live, New York, but let's go further and actually require a plan that has teeth in getting fair housing and affordable housing to be a requirement across the state.
So programming note, we're going to open up to questions in a minute, so if you have a question, not a speech or a comment or a recipe, but a question, we'll come around to you with the mic. But Sharon, it sounds like you want to weigh in.
No, You definitely took the words out of my mouth, and I really appreciate you for echoing that. We are very much, I guess, encouraged that Governor Cuomo is taking some meaningful steps to address fair housing issues in the state. And I think also the conversation has to be brought into, this is not just a city problem, right? This is also like a regional problem. And so we really need to begin to think about how is it that people are actually isolated to the city itself and not able to have very little mobility to move out into the suburbs or where their jobs may be, or where there may be better schools, or where there may be better opportunities. And so I really think Governor Cuomo could actually force some type of regional collaboration here, or encourage some regional collaboration. But I also, I mean, like I said, I'm excited and that he's joined us with the other fair housing groups. I believe it's Texas Appleseed, two groups out of Dallas, and one group out of DC as well. And we'll see where, NAFA, oh gosh, I'll be totally remiss, National Fair Housing Alliance, for, leading this, for champion, and being the first, so we're encouraged that Cuomo is championing this cause and being the first state to join onto this lawsuit, but we'd like to see more, just a little bit more.
I think, do you want to weigh in on that?
No, the regional piece of it.
That was me. Okay.
So I guess I'm also just gonna nudge us a little in this conversation, is those states do absolutely have that. But I also think one of the things that AFFH is sort of pushing and calling on us all to do is think about what they have, but also what's still missing, right? So you can have a statewide fair housing plan and a statewide fair share plan. I know that means different things in different audiences, but fair share housing, not environmental, and still have an extremely discriminatory housing system and housing practice, right? And so some is about, is every jurisdiction including a certain amount or their share or their allocation, or creating a fair housing plan in terms of low-income units or affordable units. We still have to have the conversation of what are the barriers in the private market, where are the discriminatory practices, and who is accessing those affordable units, who isn't getting access to them. And I think that that's sort of the next step that everybody's got to have together, is it's not just enough to say everyone creates your affordable housing units, it's also recognizing not everyone has access to all of those things the same way. Both conversations have to happen.
Questions from the audience?
We're all afraid of Abby's question.
Well, I think going back to what the councilmember said about rezoning, it's not that you're against the rezonings that have happened, you're just saying that there need to be rezonings in in different neighborhoods, like high-income neighborhoods. And then I think Layla before had been saying that, well, it's not true that only low-income neighborhoods are developing, like there's development happening. So I just wanted to explore that further, I mean, we've written about our city limits, have written about RPAs. Some people have suggested certain neighborhoods that potentially could accommodate more space and are higher income. I think some that have been thrown out have been Forest Hills, or I'm trying to think what are some of the others, Riverdale, is that right? So I feel and then I've heard, the response to that being one, neighborhoods don't have enough infrastructure to accommodate growth. Two, there would be too much political opposition from your colleagues in the council. So I guess my question to both of you is well, what's the state of that? Is the problem, what is the problem there? Why not? And yeah, where's the discussion?
I'll say, there are a number of factors that the city looks at in making these decisions, and I think, where there's existing infrastructure that supports transport-oriented development, that is certainly one thing. But I wouldn't say that, I'd say that infrastructure investment is actually part of growth planning, so I'm not sure where you might have heard that as a barrier to going into other neighborhoods. I think that the city is absolutely open to rezoning areas that make sense for the city to initiate a rezoning in. And we're happy to work with local members and local groups. A lot of times members do reach out to us first about their interest in considering using zoning as a tool for planning for the future of their neighborhood. So we're open to it. I do think local willingness is a part of that, but I think it's not the only barrier. I'd say there's a lot of members in the council who are very open to planning for the future of their neighborhoods while also preserving what's good. Brad, I don't know if you want to speak to some of the experience that you have.
Sure, I'll add it. First, I do want to thank Abigail and Jared for the reporting on this. I think City Limits reporting on this set of issues has been really critical in like pushing all of us. So thank you for that. Yeah, you can clap for that. This is obviously hard, you know, yes, is it harder to get a neighborhood rezoned where the constituents and the elected official don't want it rezoned? Of course it's harder, I mean, especially the way our ULURP process is designed, and obviously we should not have the policy be, well, we'll rezone the neighborhoods where people want to, and we won't rezone the neighborhoods where people don't want to. So, I mean, I do think here we need a broader process shift. I mean, I believe that creating a proactive, comprehensive planning process every 10 years or so, which sounds like it'll take forever and slow development down, I actually think is the right way to go, because I don't know how you could do a transparent process that says, here's how much we think the city is growing, needs to grow, how many new units we have. Here's where we think the infrastructure capacity is right, or where, with some strategic infrastructure investments, it could be right. Here's a range of reasons why we think that makes sense. We're going to do it in a relatively fair and transparent way that includes fair housing and a fair share of other kinds of things as part of our goals. And then we'll come out with a plan that says, here's what the growth shares are of different neighborhoods. Now you've got to give people an incentive to do that, because in almost every neighborhood they're going to say, no, rather not. But there is a sort of a process that people have used in other places around the world where they do this, of cross-acceptance, where if you lean into your growth share, if you're more open to the fact that your neighborhood's got to, I don't want to say bear the burden, but help achieve the growth, you have more ability to shape what you need in your neighborhood to accomplish it, how that growth is distributed, and where things go, so that you have something more than like, is the council member already on board? You have, look, this is for a range of reasons based on infrastructure capacity, based on urban built form, what makes sense here from some broader level, and if you won't fight us, then where the schools go, what the infrastructure investments are, where the open space is, what other kinds of resource investments are made will flow. And if not, we're still going to come, but you're going to have less ability to shape how that happens. So that's not a simple process, but I do think it's something, and you know, as the council kicks off our Charter Revision Commission, following this year's mayoral Charter Revision Commission, I think these issues of development, of the right role of communities, in shaping development without being able to, you know, close the door and thinking about what that process looks like and how it includes these goals of fair housing and equity that we're talking about is a really critical conversation.
Okay, so just I want to move on. Addendum to Rule 1, if you are a recently departed City Limits employee, you can ask a question that long, but no one else can. So.
Wait, Jared, can I? Sorry, because I
real fast.
So I think what Brad was sort of talking about is where we could go, but I also do want to go back to sort of where we are right now in the rezonings. That list of places that are potentials that maybe don't have infrastructure or do have this, or whatever the list is that we're operating from as options, is not something that we as residents of New York City and us in the housing community or planning community know. So I think it's a little bit hard in the sense of it's not a transparent process to know. Like there's all sorts of, there's an art side of this, but there's also a science side, and we sort of don't get to see either one of them in terms of how you become a part of a list of 20 and then we choose 8, right? And then I think the other piece is, to push back a little, is that I don't necessarily think that the places that are being rezoned now, and you didn't say this, Brad, but just to say it, are not necessarily places where neighborhoods or necessarily their elected officials are saying okay, right? And Emily Goldstein in our office wrote about, we do have to think about this is tied to power and segregation and the history of access. And what do you do if you're a neighborhood where it takes you 5 years to get a light change, and all of a sudden somebody is presenting you with the opportunity to have a lot of investment and a lot of infrastructure tied to something that you may or may not love. That's a really hard place to put both a community and an elected official. And sort of recognizing that in many cases, that is the dynamic that we're placing communities in, and largely layered on communities of color and low-income communities.
Your question?
Thank you. Brilliant presentation. City limits, we're always indebted to you all. Thank you. I'm Ken Brown. I'm the district manager at Community Board 5 in the Bronx, which is half of the rezoning that recently, or is in the process of passing. And there's quite a few questions I could ask, certainly, but what I want to do is synthesize down to a couple. In my experience with the Jerome Avenue rezoning, I think the Department of City Planning did a reasonably good job in terms of outreach, I almost said marketing, outreach to the community and having design charrettes. However, in our community, we don't have a whole lot of urban planners that are living there. So DCP will come and present, they'll have lots of nice charts, it'll look very flashy, they'll throw around some jargon, and people, I think, would get overwhelmed. And they wouldn't know how to push back or express their concerns in a way that it's translatable to bureaucratese. So, in the one sense, yeah, DCP in the city is doing a lot of outreach and a lot of investment in trying to democratize this on the one hand. On the other hand, there isn't capacity to push back against that from the community. So I think that's one issue that needs to be addressed. The other one is a lot of my constituents said through the course of the rezoning, we're getting we're promised $189 million in investment. A lot of these investments are things that we should have had as a matter of right. We have 1,500 unfunded school seats today. We're talking about bringing in 4,500 odd new apartments. We were promised 500 seats and we don't have a site.
So frame a question.
So the question is, why in these historically underserved communities that are being rezoned, why do we have to pay the price of increased density to get the things that we should have had as a matter of right?
The city's doing a lot of planning and investment without rezoning neighborhoods as well. And I do think it is one of the very unfortunate parts of some of what has transpired with the rezonings, that these investments are seen as a quid pro quo. But they're not. I mean, we're doing a lot of planning and investment in neighborhoods where zoning is not being used as a tool or isn't seen yet as the necessary tool for planning. Brownsville is one of those examples. We went through a year-long planning process in the neighborhood of Brownsville, and I do think that some of the challenges you're talking about how overwhelmed communities might feel as so much information is being presented, a lot of that can be solved for through really thoughtful community engagement and a well-designed process. And that's something that we really, in my office, have really tried to hone more and more, and be really clear and transparent about what it is that people need to learn, that we need to learn about communities as we're doing work in their neighborhoods, how we can get to a place where we're co-creating things, and where there's kind of equal knowledge on both sides of the table. I do think there's a lot of technical assistance that's being provided around the rezoning. There are some partners here that provide some of that technical assistance, and some of that funding comes from the city as well for that technical assistance. So we, doing more engagement around these and better planned engagement is one solution. But I also, the types of investments that the city is making in neighborhoods is not just happening in rezoning areas. We are doing neighborhood-wide investments in other areas as well. And if I could just respond for 1 minute to some of the points Rika raised, which I think are fair to some degree. I think some of the challenges that you note are absolutely things challenges that we recognize, but require kind of a both-and approach. We both need to figure out how to, enforce the housing maintenance code in someone's building and plan for the future and plan for more units in an area where rising rents are putting putting other pressures on that same household. So I do think it's very hard, kind of the way that these plans are being experienced kind of at an individual level, but from our perspective, that's kind of the burden that we also take on, is trying to figure out how we do all of these things and balance all of these goals and try to achieve all these goals at once, knowing that the kind of status quo of housing supply is also not acceptable to us, and that we do need to be planning for growth and more equitable growth.
So I realize if I hang on to the mic when you ask the question, I get to feel more like Phil Donahue, who's always my hair hero. Any questions over here? No? Questions? Oh.
Hi there, my name is Wendy. Do you think a contributing factor of our maintenance of our housing stock could be that the property managers in the state of New York are not certified in New York? Because there's a prior report done by Betsy Gottbaum, and it critiques how HPD and their maintenance codes or lack of maintenance codes of their buildings, and that people could be on the worst landlord list for decades and decades. But if you could rate a restaurant, why can't you rate a property manager? Because in the state of New York, my hairdresser goes through more requirements to cut my hair than the property managers.
I mean, the regulations we have are the Housing Maintenance Code, and we enforce the Housing Maintenance Code. So that's the framework we have, not whether the property manager is him or herself kind of licensed. I don't, I'd actually need to catch up with my agency on exactly our position on this, but I can say my guess is we don't think it's an effective system. Licensing doesn't necessarily seem like the right solution to the problem. The problem is around enforcement of the existing housing maintenance codes and probably strengthening the housing maintenance code where there's opportunities to do that.
That raises a kind of a larger question, which is we've been talking about the city's assessment process, kind of looking at very big ticket, 15,000 feet ideas about maybe the rezonings and community preference, things like that. But maybe Brad, you could answer this. How fine-grained should this assessment of housing policy be? How deep down into the details? Things like the maintenance code, things like there are areas of Brooklyn where it's been seen as discriminatory that apartment sizes catered more to one community than the other. Should that be part of this discussion we're going to start having?
Well, I think it's a great question, and untangling what the public policies are, what the kind of developer and owner practices are, and what our own individual actions are. Like, that is the conversation to have. I think there's a lot we can do in the area of policy. Another bill that I have that's in the report would require that co-op owners give a reason when they're going to reject someone. Right now, there's essentially no way. We do have testing in rental housing to make sure people aren't violating. Because generally, the idea is our public policy, in my opinion, should affirmatively further fair housing, should seek a less segregated, more integrated city. From owners, from landlords and developers, we should expect that they don't discriminate. We probably should not say to a private owner, you must seek to have your building occupied by an integrated set of people. Like, that's probably further than at least we're ready to go today. But we ought to say you can't discriminate, and right now in co-ops we just don't have any policy to prevent discrimination. So just that simple requirement, you have to give a reason for rejection that obviously could be challenged in court if it's false, and a cover for discrimination. I think on this question of our individual choices that Barika sort of raised before, every year I try to go to the graduation of the 5th graders from the Brooklyn New School, which is the most integrated school in my district. It was started 25 years ago as an intentionally integrated school, public school, elementary school in New York City. And I'm really confident that if people would sit with me at that 5th grade graduation, they would want their kids, probably in the Brooklyn New School, but at least in an integrated elementary school. And that the benefits to all of us from having that kind of school instead of the segregated ones we mostly have are powerful. And it seems to me that, I think probably a lot of people in this room agree, but there's work to do, that demonstrating what it looks like when we actually build a more inclusive, more fair, more equal, more integrated city is compelling. And we obviously should not be dictating individual people's choices in lots of the places that they are. But if we start, instead of just trying to prevent discrimination, making more often the default option an integrated one, I think over time we will not only reverse the legacy of discriminatory, systemically racist public policy, but help people lean into making those choices more often than they do.
So I'm hearing a lot about the concern that the 20 to 30% of the units in MAH developments and in these rezoned areas will reinforce the segregation that already exists. I guess I'm a little bit more concerned about the 70 to 80% that are market rate. And I'm curious if MAH has been around long enough for us to understand, and maybe HPD can, maybe enlighten, what the population looks like who are moving into those market rate units, and if they're white and middle and upper middle class, and how that in itself could be a form of discrimination under the Fair Housing Act, and how or why not the ULURP process is not bringing that racial displacement out as well.
So I think I can pretty strongly and clearly say, A, we don't know, and we haven't really had enough time. I think the first MIH building is still in construction, maybe just went to marketing, just closed. So MIH is still in its very, very new years. Still, combined with that, to my understanding and in my experience of looking at the city's housing data, tracking the race of who moves into housing units is not something that is normally done, and is definitely not something that is publicly available, right? So being able to say, we invested X amount of money in this building, or this set of buildings, or this set of units in a community, and what does that building now look like, isn't actually something that we can really do, right? And I think that this is some of the, we're moving to the housing and income conversation, but having the next set of conversations as well, right? We've created a 20%, a 30%, a 50% affordable building, but we still don't know who's in that building. We still don't know what that looks like, and we still don't know what that building looks like in relationship to the broader community is creating opportunities and integration, or tension and problems, right? Both things are possible, right? So I was going to say, Jarrett was raising as a part of where we live in this AFFH process, housing policy. I would say some of the things that are most strongly tied to this are not housing policies at all, right? I have circumstances of being harassed on the streets. We just had stuff in the news of somebody being harassed when they moved into a building. I just stopped and saw a bunch of kids get harassed by the police, right? Somebody who regularly has their neighbors call transportation on them based on where they park. None of those have to do with housing policies, and all of those things are things that will, in a heartbeat, make you say, this is not a neighborhood where I need to live anymore, right? And so I think we've got to know that, I'm not saying this to let HPD or off the hook and Layla off the, but it's not all in their court, right? Some of this is we've got to have this conversation with some of the agencies who aren't at the table, right? The HPD is having this conversation. Some people are totally absent of it and want to pretend like it's not there or it's not an issue. And what is it, how do we force that conversation, not just in the folks in the administration, the agencies and the individuals also who are ready to have it, but also sort of citywide. Some agencies are having this, and some agencies don't want to talk about race at all. So what does that look like?
So we're winding down. I think that's it for questions from the crowd. I had a question for Layla, I guess, about looking down the road when this process is done, we've identified problems, we've set out some goals and possible policies. How assured are we that the next step's going to occur? Because affirmatively furthering fair housing was predicated on the idea that if you didn't do it, you wouldn't get the federal money for housing. But depending on the direction of the federal government, that money might dry up anyway. Some of these issues may require significant public investment. The report will be done as we enter the last 2 years of the mayor's term. Are we sure that the next step's going to happen?
So I'm of two minds of this. I'll answer the question. Yes, the next steps are going to happen. I think the thing that I think about a lot is, there's 3.4+ million units of housing in this city. HPD constructs in a good year or finances 8,000 new units. Okay, so we are a drop in the bucket of the housing that exists in the city. There's only so much we can impact in terms of outcomes of those residential living patterns when you think about it that way. But I'm very optimistic and hopeful about the types of policies that us and our sister agencies and with the help of stakeholders and other New Yorkers are going to be digging into to make sure that we are on the right path to be having more fair and equitable neighborhood investments and neighborhood development policies, which will have broader impacts, further down the line. There will be a real, it feels very bureaucratic to say we're going to have this great report, but it's going to, it's going to be a framework that has real goals and things that people will be able to hold us accountable to. But again, in terms of the kind of impact on residential living patterns, I'm an optimist, so I think this work is worth doing and we should be trying, but it does keep me up at night when I think about, that we are a city of 3.4 million units, and we create 8,000 in a good year.
So that sets up my final question, which I want to hear everybody for like 30 seconds on, which is, let's talk about what success will look like and how we'll know we're there. I think Brad's report talked about 81% of New Yorkers would have to move to create a city that was not segregated. That seems unlikely. And you obviously do have some voluntary segregation, right? I mean, the reason why Woodlawn's an Irish neighborhood is because Irish people moved there. The reason why Greenpoint used to be Polish is because Poles moved there. They weren't forced to. And it creates some of the kind of, interesting fabric of the city. So how will we know that we've gotten to the point where New York is as desegregated as it can be and still be New York? What does that look like?
Well, I'll start here. I think what it would look like is, having more better integrated schools, right? And having, higher graduation rates and opportunities for Black and brown children in our communities, right? And, it's having more communities of color enter into the workforce and actually staying there, right? It's creating, and it's also, people not being afraid, to Marika's point, not being afraid to access certain neighborhoods because they know that they will be antagonized by someone else by someone who looks different than them. And it's ensuring that literally the least of us have a place to stay and live and thrive and grow, right? Not only for themselves, but their family members as well.
So I've joked in the past that like 10% less segregated does not make like a great sign to march with. But what I would say is, boy, I don't know that trying to imagine like perfect desegregation is that useful. It's like, let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the slightly less corrosively terrible. Right now we have on schools about 6% of New York City's kids in truly reflective, schools that truly reflect the city. So let's get to 12, and then let's get to 18 and then 20. And I guess what I think is when we're there, we'll be on a durable path where more people actually think that a city of more equality and opportunity and integration is the one we want. I mean, this goes to your question to Layla. We don't have the political will. In the last, in the 2013 mayoral campaign, there was no dialogue about these issues. New Yorkers in large numbers did not expect our mayoral candidates to articulate a fair housing or a school integration agenda. None. You go back, this is basically zero conversation about it. So, and it's been perceived as a third rail political issue that you would be foolish to bring up in a political context, so now things have shifted a little to where the mayor and the city is kind of on the hot seat. Why aren't you doing more? But we do have to kind of look at ourselves. We have not built a broad political movement that expects it to happen, and I think those two things go together. I think that we're not at risk of losing the kind of ethnic neighborhoods that have made New York as a result of desegregation policy anywhere in the near term. In some cases due to gentrification, yes, but not due to intentional policies for fair housing and integration. If we could get it going a bit in that direction, then I think we can get a feedback loop where we build a broad set of political support, the ability to talk about it in ways that are less tribally polarizing and third rail, and where more people, come out of that graduation at the Brooklyn New School saying, I'm glad I made this choice.
Layla, how about for you?
Yeah, I'd say for me, success, and for us, success looks like, when we can start actually measuring, more, that basically the severe disparities that you still see play out geographically are less severe and hopefully better. Where you live, even though this is kind of an overused metaphor, doesn't determine your life outcomes or your likely health outcomes or how long you're going to live. I think part of the real darkness of segregation right now is that it's still correlated with a lot of these disparities and inequities. And I think success is less where everyone lives and more how we change those outcomes and those disparities that are correlated with place.
And final word.
So I think it's a balance of ensuring that folks have choice and a certain amount of agency, right? To sort of say, this is what I want to do and exercise. Including the choice and agency to say, I like my neighborhood in Chinatown, I like my neighborhood in Koreatown, I want to be in a mostly Bengali community or senior community or whatever it is. But then also making sure that in doing that, as Layla was saying, wherever it is that somebody chooses to exercise that they are not then sort of trapping themselves into a set of things or being trapped by others into a set of things that determine health, schools, education, but list off the whole set of queue. But then I would add the last piece of that is then also making sure that we are not giving anybody or unintentionally creating the power and systems dynamics to do that to people, right? That there is a lot of by exercising my agency to live in a certain neighborhood, I prevent that agency of somebody else. And sort of creating, not allowing that dynamic, both in terms of an individual person, a building owner, a broker, but also our policies as a city, as a state, and as a federal government. So.
Well, I'd like to thank the people who helped put this evening together. The folks at WeWork have been great. Sadef and Sneha, our videographer, Mark, and of course Fran and Adina, especially for setting it up. Let's give them a round of applause. And the council, I mentioned it before, but for 2 years, Abigail Savage-Lew anchored our reporting on this, did an amazing job. So I'm very, very grateful to her for all her work. I want to wish Ramadan Kareem or Ramadan Mubarak to our friends of the Muslim faith for this evening. And I'd like to most importantly thank our panel for their amazing job, and thank you all very much for coming.